I've lived in my suburban neighborhood for nearly 10 years. It's a quiet, comfortable place, full of families and retirees. Nothing much happens here, and that's how we all liked it, until 2 years ago, when the new neighbor moved in. It was an unassuming house, like all the others on the street. For years, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henson had lived there. When she passed away, the house sat empty for a while. Then, one afternoon, I noticed a moving truck outside. The new occupant was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, tall, with dark graying hair and a worn leather jacket. He kept to himself, not bothering with introductions. I'd see him coming and going at odd hours, always alone, always quiet. At first, no one thought much of it. Plenty of people preferred their privacy. But as the weeks went by, something about him seemed off. My wife and I began to notice little things. The lights in his house were always on, even in the middle of the night. Sometimes, late into the evening, we'd hear strange noises, like furniture being dragged across the floor or muffled banging. One night, around 1 a.m., I was up late watching TV when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked out the window and saw him standing in his yard, motionless, staring straight at our house. He was barely illuminated by the dim streetlight, but I could tell he was just standing there, doing nothing, for what felt like hours. I told my wife about it the next morning, but she brushed it off as harmless. Days turned into weeks, and the man remained an enigma. We rarely saw him during the day, and when we did, he barely acknowledged us or anyone else. Rumors started spreading among the neighbors. Some people said they saw him digging in his backyard at odd hours. Others claimed to hear crying from inside his house, though no one had ever seen anyone else enter or leave. The strangest part was that he never seemed to receive any visitors, not even delivery drivers. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Saturday, and my wife was out of town visiting family. I was home alone, doing some work in the living room, when I heard a loud crash from next door. I rushed to the window and saw that the man's front door was wide open. I hesitated, unsure if I should go over. What if he was hurt? What if someone had broken in? My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and walked across the street. The house was eerily quiet. I called out, but there was no response. Cautiously, I stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, and stale, as if the windows hadn't been opened in years. The living room was sparse, just a few pieces of furniture and boxes stacked against the walls. No pictures, no personal items, nothing to suggest anyone really lived there. I called out again, but still, there was no answer. My gut told me to leave, but something compelled me to keep going. I moved down the hallway toward the back of the house, where I saw a door slightly ajar. When I opened it, I realized it led to the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs, peering into the pitch-black void below. The faintest sound of shuffling reached my ears. I called out one last time, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello? Are you down there?" Nothing. Just silence. I stepped down onto the first stair, and then the second. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight. The shuffling sound grew louder, and suddenly, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a low, wheezing breath. It wasn't coming from below. It was right behind me. I froze. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned around. The man was standing there, at the top of the stairs, staring down at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. His breathing was labored, and his face was contorted into a twisted grimace. "What are you doing in my house?" he hissed. My heart pounded in my chest as I stammered an apology, backing up the stairs as fast as I could. But he didn't move. He just stood there, blocking my only exit. I thought someone might be hurt," I managed to say. He smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a cold, cruel smirk that sent chills down my spine. "No one's hurt," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But you shouldn't have come in here." I bolted past him, my legs moving before I could think. I didn't stop until I was back in my house, locking the door behind me. My heart raced for hours afterward, and I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me, even though I knew I was alone. The next day, I tried to tell my wife what had happened, but I could hardly put it into words. We both agreed to avoid him from then on. But the weirdness didn't stop. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my window. I thought it might be a tree branch in the wind, but when I opened the blinds, I saw him standing in his yard again, watching the house. This time, I called the police. When they arrived, they went to his house and knocked on the door. To my shock, they said the place was empty. Not just that he wasn't home, the house was completely abandoned. No furniture, no boxes, no sign that anyone had lived there for months. Confused and unnerved, I asked the officer if there had been any reports of the man recently. That's when they told me something I'll never forget. The man I'd been seeing had died 2 years ago, just a few months after moving in. They found his body in the basement. It's been months since that incident, and the house remains empty. Sometimes, though, when I'm up late, I think I still hear those strange noises, coming from the direction of his house. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know better. I never should have gone into that basement. When my wife Sarah and I moved into our new house, it felt like the perfect neighborhood. It was one of those quiet suburban areas where the lawns are always mowed, and neighbors exchange polite waves. It had taken us years to save up for a place like this, and we couldn't have been happier. We didn't know anyone yet, but that's normal when you first move in. At least, that's what we told ourselves. Our house was situated between two others. The family on the left was friendly enough, a couple with 2 kids, the usual. But the neighbor on our right, that was another story. I'll never forget the first time I saw him. It was a gray morning, the type where the clouds hang low in the sky and you can smell rain in the air. I was sitting on our front porch, sipping my coffee, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Turning my head, I saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, with scraggly hair and a long, faded coat. He was standing on his porch staring at me, no wave, no smile, just staring. I gave a hesitant nod, hoping to break the awkwardness, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, his eyes boring into me. It sent a chill down my spine. I quickly grabbed my coffee and went inside. Over the next few days, I noticed him more and more. I'd be mowing the lawn, and there he was, watching from his window. If Sarah and I were unloading groceries, he'd be standing by his front door, never saying a word. He never seemed to leave his house, but he was always there, always watching. I chalked it up to paranoia at first. Moving into a new place can be unsettling, and maybe he was just a little socially awkward. But then things started to get weirder. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards. At first, I thought it was Sarah moving around in bed, but when I turned over, she was fast asleep. The noise was coming from outside. I got up, quietly moved to the window, and peeked through the blinds. He was standing in our yard. My heart raced. I couldn't make sense of it. Why would he be standing there in the middle of the night? I was about to wake Sarah when I noticed something in his hands, a shovel. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring up at the house with the shovel resting on his shoulder. Then, without warning, he walked back toward his property and disappeared into the shadows. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Sleep deprivation plays tricks on the mind, right? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That evening, I decided to install a security camera on our porch, facing his house. I didn't tell Sarah. She was already freaked out by the guy and didn't need another reason to lose sleep. For a few days, nothing happened. The camera didn't pick up anything unusual, and I started to relax. But then, one night, the camera caught something. It was around 3 a.m. when my phone buzzed. The camera had detected movement. I opened the app and saw him again, our neighbor, standing at the edge of our yard. This time, he wasn't holding a shovel. He was just standing there, staring directly into the camera. He knew I was watching. I called the police that night. They came by, did a quick sweep of the area, and even knocked on his door. No answer. They told me to call again if he trespassed, but there was nothing they could do if he stayed on his property. I felt helpless. Things escalated from there. One afternoon, Sarah came home from work, pale and shaken. She had found a dead bird on our doorstep, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. It was unsettling, but we tried to convince ourselves it was just a stray animal, maybe a neighborhood cat. But then it happened again. And again. Every few days, a new dead animal, birds, squirrels, even a rabbit, would appear on our porch. Always the same twisted neck, always arranged neatly at the foot of our door. I knew it was him, but I had no proof. I became obsessed. Every night I'd sit in front of the security monitor, waiting for him to do something. But he never came close enough for me to confront him. He stayed just out of reach, lurking in the shadows, knowing that I knew but powerless to stop him. One evening, as I was pulling into the driveway after work, I noticed something odd. The blinds in one of the windows of his house were open, just enough to see inside. Normally the place was sealed up tight, like a tomb, but now I had a glimpse. Curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced over. What I saw chilled me to the bone. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, and they were all of us, Sarah and me. Pictures of us in the yard, in the house, at the grocery store. There were even pictures of us sleeping, taken from outside our bedroom window. I couldn't breathe. I slammed my car door and ran inside, locking every door and window behind me. In the morning, I called the police again, but this time, they took me more seriously. 2 officers went to his house while I watched from the window. They knocked, and for the first time since we moved in, he answered the door. What happened next is still burned into my mind. He stepped out onto his porch, smiled at the officers, and shook their hands. They chatted for a few minutes, then he waved them off as they got back into their car and left. He turned to face my house, and from across the yard, he smiled directly at me. I moved out the next day. I never considered myself the suspicious type, nor did I have much time to be. My days were routine, a blur of work, gym, and mindless streaming to unwind in the evenings. But when the house next door sold a few months ago, something shifted. It wasn't immediate, and I didn't think much of it at first. It was an old, creaky house, a Victorian with sagging eaves and peeling paint. The kind you figure would get demolished and replaced by something sleek and modern. To my surprise, it was bought rather than torn down, and a new neighbor moved in. Middle-aged guy, tall, fit, but in a lean, sinewy way. There was something about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that unsettled me. I first noticed him early one Saturday morning, not long after he moved in. I was heading out to run errands and spotted him in the driveway, tinkering under the hood of a car that looked far too nice to belong to that decrepit house. I waved, out of habit, but he just stared. No nod, no smile. Just a cold, piercing look that followed me as I backed out of my driveway. I told myself he was just one of those reclusive types. Plenty of people keep to themselves, especially in neighborhoods like mine, where most residents are older or too busy to engage. Still, the way he watched me, his eyes too intense for a casual glance, it stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I'd catch glimpses of him, always outside at odd hours, mowing the lawn at dusk or pulling weeds in the dark. If I went to take out the trash late at night, there he was, sitting on his porch, smoking and staring straight ahead. He never approached me, never said a word, but his presence was suffocating. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it, but I chalked it up to my exhaustion. Maybe I'd left it open that morning. Nothing seemed out of place inside, so I didn't dwell on it. But as I stepped back onto the porch to lock up properly, I glanced over at his house. He was standing by his window, partially obscured by the sheer curtains, watching me. My skin prickled. I turned away quickly and shut the door behind me, locking it with more care than usual. I went about my evening, cooking dinner and settling in front of the TV. But the feeling of being watched lingered. I checked the locks again before going to bed. It felt ridiculous, but something wasn't right. A few nights later, it happened again. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint creaking sound. I lay in bed, my heart pounding, listening. It could have been the wind, I told myself. The house was old, after all. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, the sound of a floorboard groaning under weight. My house was one story. There shouldn't have been anyone walking upstairs. I stayed still, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I was wide awake now, adrenaline coursing through me. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept through the house, flipping on lights as I went. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. The front door was locked. Everything looked normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I decided to install a security camera. It seemed like overkill, but I couldn't ignore the strange occurrences. I ordered one online, and while I waited for it to arrive, I kept to myself, avoiding any interaction with the man next door. He seemed to sense the shift. His cold stares intensified whenever I crossed his path, and the way he lingered outside felt purposeful, like he was waiting for something. A few days later, the camera arrived. I installed it at the front door and another by the back porch. That night, I slept a little easier, knowing I could check the footage if anything happened again. And sure enough, it did. It was just past 2 a.m. when my phone buzzed, alerting me that the camera had detected movement. I opened the app, expecting to see a stray cat or some other harmless disturbance, but what I saw made my blood run cold. There, on the screen, was the man next door, standing at the edge of my driveway, staring up at my house. He didn't move for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a few minutes. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back to his house, disappearing into the shadows. I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning I called the police, but when they arrived, there wasn't much they could do. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic but dismissive. "It's not illegal to stand in your own driveway," he said with a shrug. I tried to explain the eerie behavior, the feeling of being watched, but without any concrete evidence of a crime, they couldn't take action. The man's behavior escalated after that. I'd hear footsteps on my porch late at night, but when I checked the camera, the footage would be blank. One evening, I came home to find my front door unlocked again, though I knew I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, nothing was missing, but there was a subtle shift. Furniture slightly out of place, drawers open just an inch. It was as though someone had been inside, rummaging, but hadn't taken anything. One night, after hearing footsteps again, I made the decision to confront him. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police if things got out of hand, and headed next door. His house was dark, but I knocked anyway. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. And finally, I heard footsteps inside. The door creaked open just a crack, and there he was, staring at me through the narrow gap. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, gravelly. I swallowed hard. I think there's been some confusion. I've noticed you outside my house at night, and..." Before I could finish, he cut me off. "You shouldn't be worried about me," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "You should be worried about the things you don't see." With that, he closed the door in my face, leaving me standing there, heart racing. I didn't know what to make of his words, but they stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. The final straw came about a week later. I was going through the footage from the night before, fast-forwarding through the usual empty clips, when I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the middle of the night, the camera by the back porch caught a figure, someone creeping around the side of the house. It was hard to make out, but it wasn't the man next door. It was someone else, someone taller, bulkier, dressed in all black. I called the police again, and this time, they took it seriously. They searched the area, but found no one. Still, they advised me to stay somewhere else for a few nights, while they kept an eye on the neighborhood. I packed a bag and stayed with a friend. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. A few days later, I learned that the man next door had vanished. No one knew where he'd gone, and the house was left empty, as though he'd never been there at all. I moved shortly after that. I couldn't stay in that house, not after everything that had happened. Sometimes, late at night, I think about his warning, the things you don't see. I still don't know what he meant, but I'm not sure I want to find out.